I, like I'm sure many other people who are here tonight, are deeply indebted to your work. It's been absolutely essential in helping us cut through the kind of garbage that we're faced with every day when we try to figure out what's going on in the world. Then it seems like to me the question that we face is how to organize to change that system, to challenge capitalism. And I think in that effort, you do a disservice to your listeners and to the people who respect your work when you equate Lenin with Stalinism as blithely as you did tonight. I say that, and I think it's also important to point out that that is an unquestioned assumption and also an easy applause getter we saw that you share with the mainstream media. And
And I think what I said is approximately what you said, except I didn't use some of that rhetoric. Which I don't think is particularly helpful to tell you the truth, either analytically or to understand or whatever. But it's the same picture. John Jay had it straight. The people who own the country ought to govern it, and the people who own the country have basically now are a network of corporations and conglomerates and banks and so on. They ought to govern it, and the way they do it is by the methods we've described. Now, as far as the Soviet Union is concerned, I didn't happen to talk about it tonight, but I've written about this topic. I haven't just made the charge. I've written about it and explained why I think it's true. And it doesn't bother me if I happen to agree with the mainstream media on this. Trotsky, to pick somebody who you remember, once he was charged in the 1930s with agreeing with the fascists in his condemnation of the Soviet Union. And he pointed out that his critique was to be true. He wasn't going to abandon it if somebody else happened to say it for different reasons. So the question is about the Soviet Union, and particularly about Lenin. So what was Leninism? Well, here we have to look at the facts. Now, you look at the facts, I think here's what you find. Lenin was a right-wing deviation of the socialist movement, and he was so regarded. He was regarded as that by the Marxists, by the mainstream Marxists. We've forgotten who the mainstream Marxists were because they lost, and you only remember the guys who won.
We only remember who won. That's right. And it was Lenin who absolutely dominated the so-called mainstream Marxists, as well as everyone else. Why was that?
But if you go back to that period, the mainstream Marxists were people like, for example, Anton Pannekoek, who was head of education for the Marxist movement, and he's one of the people who Lenin later denounced as an infantile leftist. But he was one of the leading intellectuals of the actual Marxist movement. Rosa Luxemburg was another mainstream Marxist, and there were others. And they were very critical. In fact, Trotsky was one up until 1917. They were all very critical of Leninism because of this, what they regarded as this opportunistic vanguardism, the idea that the radical intelligentsia were going to exploit popular movements to seize state power and then to use that state power to whip the population into the society that they chose.
Opportunistic vanguardism. So Trotsky was a mainstream Marxist until 1917, when he suddenly joined Lenin to take part in this opportunistic hijacking of the popular so-called mainstream Marxist movement that involved whipping the population into a society that they chose, that they wanted to create. Okay. I have to ask, how does this keep happening? Every single one of these popular, democratic, libertarian, Marxist movements turns into a dictatorship. From the USSR, to Castro in Cuba, Vietnam, North Korea, to China, and on and on. Why do you suppose this keeps happening? And then we have to endure this statement in the Democratic line. True Marxist socialism has never been tried.
Now that was quite inconsistent with Marxism as understood by the mainstream sort of, I'd say, left Marxists. From this point of view, Bolshevism was a right-wing deviation. Trotsky made the same points up till 1917. Now, when Lenin came back to Russia in April 1917, he took a different line, quite a different line from the one he'd had in the past. You take a look at Lenin's work, it shifted character in April 17. In April 1917, it became kind of libertarian. That's when he came out with the April Theses, and that's when he wrote State and Democracy. It came out a year later, but that's when it was written. And these were State and Revolution. These were basically libertarian works. They were very much more in the mainstream of sort of left libertarian socialism, from sort of, you know, this range that goes from anarchism over to left Marxism of the Pannekoek-Luxemburg variety. And he talked about Soviets and the need for, you know, a workers' organization and so on. And in fact, came really closer to what the essence of socialism was always understood to be. After all, the core of socialism was understood to be workers' control over production. That was the core. That's where you begin.
Workers' control over production is a Marxist definition of what they believe socialism is. Socialist action, to be more exact. Socialism at its core is directly related to the united cooperation in any group. Socialism is like the glue that holds any community or group, state or nation or economy together, so social cooperation can occur. Every type of community has a level of social cooperation, or they would cease to be a community. Socialism is what allows the social cooperation or socialistic action to occur. Every person depends on some sort of socialism to receive social benefits and cooperation from the community. And therefore, everyone is a socialist. The sanitary worker needs the doctor. The doctor needs the sanitation worker. The true definition of socialism from a Marxist perspective would be worker solidarity socialism. And it is that solidarity that allows the worker cooperation and ownership, and therefore, future ownership of production. It's what allows that operation to occur. Another example to perhaps bring clarity to this more accurate definition, and that would be take the traditional heteronormative or so-called nuclear family. It is made up of a hierarchical cooperative structure with the father at the top, the mother right below, and the children underneath. The primary glue or socialism of the so-called nuclear family is common DNA or racial profile. This type of flesh and blood based socialism that features a seemingly very natural bias in favor of your own family with a certain level of discrimination towards all other groups is precisely the bedrock and foundation of the mid-century Germans and Little Mustache Man, what would later become known as National Socialism.
Then you go on to other things. But the beginning is control by the workers over production. That's where it begins. Then Lenin took power in October 1917 in what's called a revolution, but in my view ought to be called a coup. And things followed that coup, or revolution if you want to call it that. One of the things that followed it was the immediate moves to destroy the Soviets and the factory councils. Those were some of the first moves of Lenin and Trotsky after they took, Trotsky joined at that point, after they took state power. In fact, if you look at what Lenin wrote after that period, or did, you'll find it's a reversion to the earlier position. This sort of left deviation is a deviation. You could ask why. In my view, it was just opportunistic. he knew that in order to gain power, he was going to have to go along with the popular currents that were developing, which were in fact spontaneous and libertarian and socialist, as most popular movements have been, in fact, since the 17th century. And being an astute politician, which he was, he sort of went along with that and talked the line that the people wanted to hear. It's just like when an American politician goes somewhere and his pollsters tell him, say so-and-so, and he says it, doesn't mean he believes it. And I think Lenin was doing the same thing without polls. In any event, whatever your interpretation is,
it's just opportunistic, right? It's the opportunistic people, man. These Democrats, right? These Democratic Socialists are always getting dominated by these opportunistic leaders. You know, it's just a bummer. It's just bad luck, really. Right? Actually, this keeps happening because people are not actually interchangeable units. And when it comes to humans don't have equal IQ from birth. You will find in any group of people that hierarchy forms. And it is this problem of natural forming hierarchy that disturbs the idealism of the Marxist socialist. This phenomenon can be studied all through the animal kingdom. And it is not at all unique to humans. Consider, we're going to stick with humans here. Consider an imaginary sports team run by consider an imaginary sports team run democratically without a coach. Imagine how much money a capitalist owner would save by not having an expensive coaching staff to oversee the players. But that doesn't happen, and it won't happen, because leadership and hierarchies are not only inevitable, but needed. The reality is that even without a coach, leadership will attempt to establish itself. Leaders always arise, not always to successfully gain power. They don't always make it, such as in our imaginary sports team. But as in any group, the attempt for leadership and power to be seized will be observed in nature. It will happen. So therefore, you have the intellectuals preaching equality, but nature overtakes them every time. The very existence of Lenin, Mao Zedong, and Castro prove the point. Democratic socialism always fails because it is in the cloud. It is in a cloud. It is in a fantasy world of idealism. Leaders like Lenin are actually down on the ground, recognizing the reality of the situation, the reality of hierarchy, power, and the ignorance of the populace at large.
When he took power, he reverted to the former vanguardism and moved at once to eliminate the organs of workers' control. Now that meant he was moving to destroy socialism, if socialism has as its core workers' control over production. The Soviets and the factory councils were instruments of workers' control. And you could say they're defective instruments, it's never worked out better and so on, yeah, no doubt. But they were the instruments that had been developed in the course of popular struggle to implement basically workers' control, and those were the first things to go. By early 1918, it's still really before the Civil War set in, Lenin's view was pretty clearly expressed. It was the view that both he and Trotsky took the position that what you need is what Trotsky called a labor army, which is submissive to the control of a single leader. He said modern progress and development and socialism requires that the mass of the population subordinate themselves to a single leader in a disciplined workforce. Well, that has absolutely nothing to do with socialism. In fact, it's the exact opposite of it, and was criticized for that by in a spirit of some solidarity, because the revolutionary forces were still operative. He was criticized for that by people like Rosa Luxemburg and by Pannekoek and Gorter and the other mainstream sort of left Marxists. And I think they were right. It seems to me that, and then it just goes on from there. I mean, Lenin reconstructed the czarist systems of oppression often more efficiently, Cheka, KGB, and other techniques of control and oppression. I think from that point on, there was nothing remotely like socialism in the Soviet Union. I think it was, in fact, in my view, is a precursor of later forms of totalitarianism.
He destroyed the Soviets. All right. The truth is, he was required to do so for the movement to continue. And this is the part that Democrats never understand. Here's the truth. Since leaders in hierarchy always form, Lenin proving the rule, without a highly propagandized and educated populace, every leader who would naturally arise in each one of those Soviets becomes a potential threat to the Marxist state. This is why so-called systems of oppression, KGB, etc., are also reintroduced, and it is to wage war against the potential leaders that might arise and take advantage of the ignorant populace. You don't just take a country by force in which much blood is spilled and just hand it over to the ignorant population and their would-be leaders.
Now, you could, that's what I think happened, and I think that's what you discover if you look at the facts. Now, why is it called socialism? Well, I think that's complicated, and we should look at it. There's the Soviet Union calls it socialism. And after they took control they did take control pretty soon of most of the international socialist movement, because primarily of the prestige of having created something sort of socialism. Incidentally, just a side remark, Lenin remained, despite it all, a sort of an orthodox Marxist in many respects. And as an orthodox Marxist, he didn't believe that it was possible to have socialism in the Soviet Union. This was supposed to be up to his death, or shortly before his death, when he was still writing, speaking lucidly. He kept the view that the Soviet revolution was a holding action. They would just kind of hold things in place until the real revolution took place in Germany, because the revolution, according to Marxist doctrine, was going to take place in the most advanced sector of modern industrial capitalism, for all the reasons that you read about in Marx. That's where the revolution had to take place. Obviously, that wasn't the Soviet Union, so there couldn't be socialism there. It was just some kind of holding action. And that presumably gave some sort of justification for eliminating the socialist institutions. I don't think it's a real justification, but probably that was the internal justification. And again, in taking that view, he was in accord with the...
So now Lenin is an orthodox Marxist. Okay, great. This illustrates the previous point. Russia at the time of the revolution was a pre-industrialized, primarily agrarian nation. It was not equipped, either technologically or even intellectually, on any scale, to bring about pure Marxist socialism. Worker solidarity socialism, democratic socialism, will never be enough to hold a nation together. Hence, even after industrialization occurs in Russia, the totalitarian state remains. However, going back to under Lenin, the later revolution was believed was believed that it would come from the most modern and industrialized nation, that being Germany. And the reason that was the case was that those folks in the most industrialized nation, the most advanced nation, would be so well versed in worker exploitation and the need for worker solidarity socialism. Now, there's also a racist racial aspect to this that cannot be ignored. As the more technologically advanced Germans were prophesied, so to speak, they were to come and dominate the international workers' movement. Well, that never happened. But as it turns out, there was a socialist revolution in Germany, but it wasn't a Marxist one. Little mustache man did agree they were the master race, and quickly set his sights eastward to colonize the then USSR, the Russian state.
Mainstream Marxist tradition. Well, after that comes the view that all of this is socialism.
Socialism is not merely about worker control over production. Socialism is in fact the glue that holds any community together. And the reality is worker solidarity, and that's what true Marxist socialism is all about. That's the glue. Worker solidarity is not enough of a uniting force to overcome natural hierarchy. This type of worker solidarity that means to undermine hierarchy, overcome it, and bring about true equality needs hierarchy to operate, to function. And unfortunately, there's always a level of corruption and totalitarianism that comes from that.